First, they told us it was voluntary. First, they posted the flyer in an email with a little green button. First, it said optional wellness workshop in friendly fonts and soft colors. They used the word voluntary like a promise. Voluntary sounded like permission. Voluntary sounded like trust. I clicked the green button. I chose a time that did not conflict with my deadlines. I wrote, "For clarity," into the subject line of the confirmation email. The calendar invitation arrived with an attached agenda. The agenda had bullet points and a speaker bio. The speaker's photo was smiling and neutral. They taught us breathing exercises. Inhale 4, hold 2, exhale 6, they said. We followed, like people following a recipe. The session ended with a link to a survey. The survey asked about sleep patterns and stress levels and dietary habits. It asked whether we felt supported at work. I answered honestly. I chose the options that fit. I typed a small note in the box. Sometimes anxious, sleep variable. A week later, an email arrived marked recommended. Recommended sounded kinder than required. Recommended sounded like advice from a friend. They recommended a follow-up course. The course had a registration form. The form had checkboxes for sessions and a field for any accommodations. I registered again. Registration felt like participation. Participation felt like keeping the door open. Then a manager suggested I attend. Suggested slid a little closer to expected. A calendar invite arrived with my manager marked as an attendee. Suggested became a sentence in a performance review. The review said, in kind language, that professional development was encouraged. It noted attendance at optional sessions as evidence of initiative. Initiative is a metric. Initiative can be tallied. Initiative can be compared. When HR sent a digest of participation rates, I saw my name bolded on a page of percentages. The digest had graphs and pie charts and a friendly headline, Engagement Update. Engagement felt like a temperature reading. Then the language shifted. Emails used words like encouraged and recommended in the morning and required in the afternoon. Notices appeared that read, mandatory for listed roles. They posted a policy memo labeled Updated Wellness Initiative. The memo explained that certain trainings were now required to ensure compliance with best practices. It said the change was to align with organizational standards. The phrase align with organizational standards is a small machine. It turns suggestions into directives with little visible force. It fits nicely on a page. A new calendar invite arrived. The invite title was blunt. Required, Wellness Compliance Training. The invite description referenced the updated policy and attached a PDF. The PDF had a checkbox at the end that read, Acknowledgement of Completion. The checkbox was small and easy to click. Next to it was a line to type your name. I typed my name. Typing your name is a little like stamping. It leaves a record that is both proof and assent. They kept calling attendance voluntary in one paragraph and required in another. The memo's margins were filled with footnotes. Footnotes are gentle ways to hide obligations. When you scroll to the end of a footnote, you find the practical language. You find the line that reads, non-compliance may affect access privileges and performance review considerations. The sentence is small and categorical. Access privileges are a kind of currency. They let you enter systems and rooms and sometimes simple comforts like ordering lunches. Performance reviews are the ledger where those privileges are scored. I clicked Accept on the invite because the alternative was a list of complications. Complications arrived as quiet emails from HR with subject lines like, Follow-up needed. Follow-up emails are polite hounds that do not sleep. They asked us to complete the training by a certain date. The date was firm. By end of quarter, read like both a timeline and a tide. When your timeline is the tide, work rearranges itself around it. Meetings are rescheduled. Projects are nudged. Life fills the gaps the policy leaves. At the required session, the facilitator smiled and said, "We know you chose to be here before, and now we're grateful you're here again." Her voice was warm, her slides were neutral. Warmth is often the soft mask of governance. We filled out a form at the training desk. The form asked us to confirm identity and role and proximity to certain teams. Proximity required definition. Definition is a tool. It slices vague things into measurable categories. It makes enforcement possible without malice. They gave us an emblem sticker after completion. The sticker read, "Compliant." Stickers are small rituals, they make invisible processes visible. A week later, an auditor visited our team. His slate was neat. He thanked us for our cooperation. Auditors are not always the enemy. They are often the instrument by which policies become recognizable realities. Reality is easier to manage when it is observed with a checklist. When an auditor asks for records, the world begins to look like paper. Logs, timestamps, sign-in sheets, these are the bones of a case. Bones are durable and hard to deny. I had filled out sleep surveys out of curiosity. I had clicked training links out of politeness. Those small actions folded into background data. Data is patient. Data waits for questions to be asked of it. When the right question comes, data arranges itself into an answer. The question that came quietly was about risk exposure. Risk exposure is the term they use when they look for nodes, people, teams, contacts. Nodes are where attention focuses. Once you are labeled a node, certain practices cluster around you. Invitations thin. Mentions contract. Permissions shift like tectonic plates. They told us that the required trainings were about safety. Safety is a noble word. It shields. Safety also stitches people into categories. There was a line in the policy that read, "Participation ensures a safer workplace for all." Safer for whom is a question the sentence does not answer. The sentence wants to close the loop of concern. I noticed small changes in the office. Reserved parking spaces for essential attendees. Access cards that required revalidation after training completion. The changes were subtle, administrative. Subtlety is effective governance. It produces compliance without parade. It rewires routines into expected patterns. An email from my manager suggested I update my profile to reflect completed compliance modules. Profile updates are small acts that ripple outward. The profile page feeds other systems. HR consolidated the records into a dashboard. The dashboard had rows and columns. Under status, my name read, "In compliance." In compliance fits into a dataset alongside many others. Datasets compare, rank, and propose interventions. They make suggestions that feel clinical and hence unassailable. Then a new directive arrived. Certain roles would be subject to enhanced monitoring. Enhanced monitoring was framed as support. Support often arrives wearing the clothes of measurement. Support asks for check-ins. Check-ins are small interviews. Interviews become transcripts, and transcripts become reference points. They said this enhanced monitoring was voluntary. The word voluntary had been worn thin by then. The offer was delivered with two paths, one that led to an easy yes and one that left you with a list of consequences. Choices are often shaped before they are presented. A choice with a visible downside is rarely free. Freedom can be a question of context. I volunteered at first. Volunteering felt strategic. I thought participation might shield me from later scrutiny. Volunteering buys you a different language in later months. It lets you say, "I opted in," with pride. But opted in sometimes becomes a data point that anchors future inferences. The check-ins were gentle at first. A facilitator would ask about sleep again, and about workload, and about coping strategies. I answered carefully, with the phrases we had practiced. In the notes, the facilitators wrote short phrases, expressed mild anxiety, reported occasional difficulty concentrating. The phrases read like neutral descriptors, but they carried traction. Traction turns descriptors into categories. Months in, attendance at the voluntary program appears as a criterion in a staffing algorithm. Algorithms take inputs and produce prioritized lists. Prioritization affects promotions and project assignments. I found myself recommended for a mentoring program with fewer decision-making responsibilities. Mentoring was sold as development. Development often comes with reduced exposure to risk and opportunity. When I asked if this was a reassignment or a supportive placement, the HR representative smiled and said, "It's both." Both is a word used to avoid choosing sides. It leaves the person inside it with less clarity. Then, one morning, a system update prompted a mandatory compliance recheck. The recheck was framed as a routine audit. Routine audits are the path by which patterns are declared stable or unstable. An automated email stated that voluntary modules had been reclassified as required for role alignment. Reclassification is a quiet administrative force. It redraws boundaries with minimal spectacle. When boundaries redraw, people's schedules redraw with them. New deadlines appear like new fences in a familiar field. You learn where you may walk and where you may not. The language in the new notice was careful. To ensure consistency across teams, participation will now be mandatory. Consistency is a noble ideal. Nobility can be persuasive. But consistency also flattens differences. It treats context as noise to be removed. Flattening is efficient for systems. It is sometimes costly for people. They asked us to acknowledge the change by signing a digital attestation. Attestation is a formalization of assent. Assent does not always equal agreement. I signed because I worried about what non-attestation might look like on a dashboard. Non-attestation is a visible omission. Omissions are noticed in systems that prize completion. When I clicked the attestation, a warning popped up. This action confirms your understanding and acceptance of the revised policy. Understandings can be broad, acceptances can be narrow. Both can be collected and circulated. Following the attestation, the team lead sent a gentle note. "Thank you for your prompt attention to this matter." Gratitude is a social lubricant. It keeps gears moving. Lubrication is practical and occasionally persuasive. The change was complete. The word voluntary lived now in older emails like a memory of a different kind of day. Memory erased by updates is a subtle form of revision. When we called past communications into question, people would point to the archived flyers and say, "We recommended this at first." Recommended is an innocent-looking verb. It can be used to build a narrative that absolves responsibility. In small ways, we adapted. We adjusted our calendars. We made room for new trainings and new forms. We learned the new phrases and used them in meetings. Adaptation is survival, and also a capitulation. It keeps you present in systems that steadily define what it means to be present. Presence becomes convertible into metrics. There were moments when I wondered whether voluntary had ever been intended. But intention is a private thing. Proofs of intent are rarer still. The public artifacts were papers and emails and attendances logged on dashboards. When something is written and signed and time-stamped, later interpretations have a labor of certainty on their side. Certainty is persuasive. It can close debates before they begin. We asked questions in staff forums. We phrased them as curiosity. We used the "for clarity" prefix that had become our safeguard. The answers were procedural. They explained the alignment with external standards and the need for documented compliance. They offered contacts and escalation paths. Escalation paths are a kind of ladder. Ladders are useful when you want to move up. They are also ways to defer decisions to other people and other times. I climbed the ladder in small steps and found that the rungs were thinner nearer the top. Thin rungs demand more care. Care can be exhausting when sustained. Meanwhile, my inbox continued to collect confirmations. Each confirmation was a small ledger entry: completed module, attestation signed, check-in logged. Ledgers are tidy. They seek to resolve slack in the world. One night I looked at my list of completed modules and realized that the voluntary programs I had once tried out of interest had become the architecture of my day. The architecture had rooms I had to pass through to reach other rooms I wanted to enter. Passing through required keycards and attestations, and sometimes an auditor's note. It felt as if choice had been repackaged as a pathway with checkpoints. Pathways are not bad by nature. They become restricting when every choice routes through a checkpoint. I asked myself quietly, where else in my life had voluntary bent into required? I thought of small social obligations that had become expectations. I thought of habits that had become rules. Systems love words that will not fight back. Voluntary is one such word when it is not observed closely. Once observed, it behaves differently. I kept a small list on my desk of the things I had chosen and the things I had felt obliged to do. The list had 2 columns. The columns were not equal in length. The column of chosen had a few bright items. The column of obliged had many small notations and a creeping grayness at the edges. Gray is the color of bureaucratic texture. I tried for a time to reclaim the voluntary by refusing a small program. Refusal invited a bureaucratic meeting. Meetings speak in neutral tones and arrive with minutes and follow-ups. In that meeting, a manager said, "We encourage you to see this as development, not discipline." The sentence was meant to soothe. Soothing is a form of persuasion. They explained that policies evolve and that alignment ensures fairness across teams. Fairness is a lovely principle. It is also a principle that can be used to justify homogenization. I left the meeting with an action item: complete the program and then we will reassess opportunities. Reassess opportunities is gentle language for conditional advancement. Conditional advancement is how systems keep leverage. Leverage is subtle. It is not always leverage you can point to. Sometimes it is a preference in a spreadsheet. Sometimes it is the absence of a recommendation on a form. I completed the program. Completion felt like satin and restraint at once. It smoothed edges and also left fingerprints. Later, a different project lead sent a note: "We are prioritizing participants who have completed the enhanced wellness modules." Prioritization is the currency of allocation. Currency moves resources and opportunities. The world outside the training room did not feel the difference immediately. The coffee tastes the same. The elevators still hum with the same cadence. Change is often invisible until it touches the ledger. And the ledger is the place where voluntary and required meet and fight and settle into definitions. In the ledger, both words are letters on a line. Letters are easy to move around. I learned to keep an eye on the ledger. I learned to read the footnotes and the revisions and the version history. I learned to save copies of the older memos with voluntary in the headline. Saving is not the same as curing. Saving notes the passage of events. Curing would mean changing the underlying mechanism. But acknowledging the change is an act of attention. Attention has an ethical shape to it. It can be the difference between being swept along and being able to name the current. They said it was voluntary. Then it was required. The sentence is short and true, and it sits on my desk like a simple fact. There are moments when I imagine policy as a river. It begins as a stream, suggestions and pilots and opt-ins. Gradually it widens, edged by reviews and audits and dashboards, until it reshapes the land it crosses. Rivers do not ask permission from the fields they pass. They change irrigation and shade and the set of crops that can be planted. People adapt, sometimes with loss. I keep a small margin in my calendar for voluntary things I will not let become required: a walk at noon, a lunch with a friend I am not reporting on, a quiet hour to read. The margin is thin and sometimes eaten away by meetings. But it is a margin nonetheless. Margins matter because they are where choices remain stubborn. Choices are not always grand, they are often a tiny resistance. Resistance accumulates like pebbles until it becomes a dam or a path. I will sign policies when I must. I will complete trainings when required. I will keep my small margins where I can. I will remember that voluntary and required are words that can travel from one state to another without much fanfare. And when they change, I will mark the moment. I will save the emails and the old memos and the green buttons. I will keep a record of how a suggestion became a mandate. Maybe records are the only honest thing left. Maybe they are the place where we can show the slow turning of language into obligation. Maybe they are the small maps that allow us to see how the door closed as we were asked to step through it. For now, I will continue to choose the small things I can control. I will attend the trainings when required and walk in the margins when I can. I will keep my ledger and my notebook and the memory of the word voluntary when it meant something different. They said it was voluntary. Then it was required. I will hold both facts in my hands and try to shape what comes next. I signed the acknowledgement at dawn. The server chimed like a polite bell. My name appeared on a list that would travel in ways I could not yet see. They sent reminders that arrived with soft tones and firm deadlines. Reminders are small instruments that sharpen intent into action. They make good intentions practical. After the attestation, an update followed. For clarity, completion is required to retain access to designated resources. Designated resources are the things that grease daily work: shared drives, archived files, certain software. Access is often the unseen rent of modern labor. When one of your permitted gates closes, you feel the slowdown immediately. A request that once took seconds now becomes a chain of permissions. Time lengthens at the edges where access is contested. They explained it as harmonization. Harmonization has the tone of music and the effect of a metronome. It aligns beats so the system can move in unison. But unison is not always desired by every musician. Some players need dissonance to make meaning. Dissonance makes new things audible. They spoke of fairness and parity in the same breath as compliance and risk. Fairness sounds moral. Compliance sounds technical. The two terms work together like gears. One gives the reason, the other gives the motion. In a memo about parity, they included an FAQ. The FAQ had answers that began with why and ended with will be monitored. Monitoring is a word with soft edges and a heavy shadow. When monitoring appears in policy, the work of daily life accrues a new rhythm. You check in. You log. You comply. At first, the logs are light, a checkbox here, a timestamp there. Later, the logs fill with annotations, exceptions, comments, cross-references. Annotations are how the institution interprets behavior. Annotations are also arguments made on paper. Arguments on paper can be decisive because they are portable. They move easily between folders and desks. Once mobile, an argument can be used in contexts far from where it originated. I began to notice where my name appeared and where it did not. Names are anchors in a sea of process. Being named in a report is a kind of tether. At a town hall meeting, a leader described the required training as an investment. Investment carries the language of return. Returns require tracking, contributions, outcomes, audits. They promised an evaluation after 6 months. Evaluations are moments when the ledger becomes a judge. People wait for them like weather reports. In the months that followed, I watched the indicators shift. Pages of the dashboard moved from amber to green and green to blue. Colors do the work of language in a hurry. They declare states without sentences. My compliance badge itched, metaphorically and in the small, literal sticker someone had affixed to an internal display. Badges are visible tokens that ask for trust and give it in return. They are both symbol and small surveillance. I met a colleague in the stairwell who had not completed the modules. He had chosen, he said, not to participate in one optional session. Optional had been converted into a conditional. He had missed a promotion for a project lead. The reason given was alignment of competencies. Competencies are measured in tick boxes as much as in skill. The conversion from voluntary to required had created a threshold. Thresholds are simple things and consequential. A floor becomes a barrier when people's feet are counted against it. I began to track how language migrated from one form into another. Recommended became expected. Suggested became aligned with role. Words are itinerant, they settle in places they were not born. When words move, so do incentives. Incentives are the invisible hands that steer decisions. Steering is not coercion, and yet it changes direction. There was a quiet restructuring of teams. Some projects were assigned to compliant participants first. Sorting is bureaucratic arithmetic. People are columns and rows. Sorting can be invisible for a long time. It is easiest to see in its effects. A rebalanced roster, fewer ad hoc tasks admitted from certain desks. Effects are where policy meets life. A colleague who had balked at the idea that anything could be involuntary was now quietly updating his resume. People move when systems compress their options. Movement is not always escape. Sometimes it is adaptation. I went to a workshop on navigating change. The facilitator asked us to write about moments when we had felt squeezed. Squeeze is an honest word. It describes context without imputing motive. People wrote about budgets and clashing deadlines and family obligations. A few wrote about the changes in training policy. The act of writing made the pressure a thing we could point to. Pointing is a small politics. It draws attention. Attention sometimes turns into remedy. But remedy is a resource, and resources are limited. There were moments when I thought the system had not known what it would become. Policies sometimes start as pilots with genuinely hopeful intent. Pilots are experiments. Experiments do not always anticipate scale. Scale is a careless force. It makes small things large and tilts the space between intent and consequence. Consequences are not always intended, but they are real. When the evaluation came, the report used the language of risk. Risk identifies exposures and suggests mitigations. Mitigations are often procedural, policies, trainings, checks. The report recommended a continued mandatory approach for high-impact roles. High impact is a designation given to some positions and not others. Designations make certain people more visible than before. Visibility can be a burden. To be visible is to be accountable in new ways. Accountable can mean scrutinized. An HR email explained that the monitoring data would be used to support career development. Support is a generous frame. Used as leverage, it becomes a conditional kindness. I watched as people learned to code their language. They moved from saying, "I feel," to saying, "data indicates," which is less messy and more portable. Portability is useful in systems that trade in files. Portability also leaves out the nuance of a face in a meeting. Nuance resists compression. Compression makes things efficient and, often, brittle. After a year, the voluntary archive looked thin. Where once a dozen pilot programs sat as optional invitations, now a half-dozen directives named them as required. Directives are like new arteries carved in a familiar map. I once overheard someone say, "It was voluntary to start because we wanted to trial with willing participants." The phrase implies consent as a methodological convenience. Consent is not a test condition, it is an ethical relation. When consent is used as a pilot, there is a risk that what begins as willingness becomes precedent. Precedent hardens into expectation. Expectations are how cultures reproduce themselves. I started keeping copies of every email that shifted intent. I saved the initial flyer that read optional and the later memo that read mandatory. Old language becomes evidence when you need to tell a story about change. There were a few brave staff meetings where people asked blunt questions. "Was this always the plan?" someone asked. Bluntness is rare because bluntness can complicate a career. The answer never fully satisfied. Leaders spoke about emergent needs and external expectations. Emergence is porous, it allows many stories to pass through. One afternoon, a small group convened to discuss the ethics of mandatory training. Ethics meetings are formal, but also fragile. Fragility is the tone of many good intentions. We talked about autonomy and about care. Autonomy is the space to choose. Care is the work to protect. The two terms sometimes conflict in policy work. Someone in the room said, "We need to decide whether our priority is protecting people or protecting the institution." The sentence was a lens. Lenses focus, but also exclude. Protecting people sometimes means accepting variance. Protecting an institution often demands predictability. Predictability is the ally of scale. We could not resolve the tension in an hour. Complexity resists tidy minutes. Minutes are useful for records but poor at making nuance last. In subsequent months, a policy addendum appeared. The addendum introduced reasonable accommodations for those with documented constraints. Accommodations are a recognition that one-size policies do not fit all bodies. Documentation became the currency of exemption. To be exempt was to have paperwork that validated difference. Paperwork is itself a form of labor. I watched a coworker navigate the accommodation process with a clinician's letter and a sequence of meetings. The process was respectful, but arduous. Respectful bureaucracy still costs time and energy. Time is a resource that disproportionately affects those with less of it. The more responsibilities you carry outside work, the costlier each extra meeting becomes. Policy often assumes a neutral life that is not universal. I started writing short notes to myself about where systems assumed a default. Defaults are powerful because they act like unspoken rules. Unspoken rules become invisible until they exclude someone. Someone on our team proposed a small experiment. Keep one voluntary offering genuinely optional for a quarter and study the outcomes. Experiments are rare in systems that have institutionalized their pilots. Rarity makes them valuable. The proposal was allowed but not funded. Funding is a practical vote of confidence. Without it, experiments struggle to breathe. I kept attending required sessions and making small notes in the margin, observations about language, about who was present, about the ways examples were selected. Margins are where things are kept alive for reconsideration. They are a form of resistance that does not require a protest. There were bureaucratic gestures meant to soften the edges, free lunches during sessions, a badge of participant that conferred coffee line priority, a quarterly recognition for engaged employees. These comforts are real and small. They do not erase the structural reconfigurations beneath them. I learned that policy is not a single thing, but many small acts sewn together. Each memo, each reminder, each checkbox is a stitch. Together they make a garment that fits some and does not fit others. I also learned that language is a material we can work with. We can ask for clarifications and for the reversal of certain designations. We can insist that a pilot remain a pilot and that voluntary mean voluntary. Sometimes our petitions were heard, sometimes they were archived. Archival is a polite decline. Decline is the most common outcome in large systems because it preserves scale. I do not think the change was malevolent. I think it was procedural. Process is both the virtue and the risk of institutions. Process can protect and it can calcify. The question is where agility remains. Where there is no agility, people find workarounds and private margins. Over time, the vocabulary in my team shifted in small ways. We said required for role alignment with the same tone we once used for recommended read. Tone is a kind of moral grammar. At home, I discussed the shift with friends who worked elsewhere. They described similar arcs, pilots that scaled into mandates, suggestions that migrated into compliance. The pattern repeated like a tune across organizations. We wondered aloud whether this was an inevitable evolution of organizational life or a moment of attention that could be redirected. Inevitability feels like history's excuse. Attention is a tool for change. Tools require deliberate hands. I kept my margins. I kept my notes. I kept the emails that said optional and those that later said mandatory. I kept them in a folder named Voluntary versus Required, as if naming could preserve the distinction. Names are a first step toward clarity. When people asked me why I still attended the voluntary lunchtime talks, I said I liked listening to different voices. Listening is a way of keeping yourself open. Openness can be a small rebellion in an era of checklists. Sometimes, later in the evening, when the office hummed quiet, I would open my saved flyers and read the original invitations. The words optional and explore and invite still appeared in their soft, hopeful fonts. The contrast between that language and the present registers like a small personal history. History matters because it teaches us how things enter our life. How something enters often determines how we live with it. Entry shapes adaptation. If I had a choice to make again, I do not know if I would decline early opportunities or embrace them distrustfully. The calculus is complicated by desire for belonging and fear of exclusion. Both are real and hard to weigh. What I now do is keep asking simple questions out loud. Who benefits? Who pays the cost? When did the voluntary become mandatory, and what mechanisms made that shift seamless? Asking is a small public act. It signals that the shift matters and that the archive is worth consulting. Archives help us remember the shape of change. I will continue to sign where I must. I will continue to fill out the forms and to attend mandated sessions. I will also hold a small space for things I choose without dashboards attached. Those small spaces are not passive. They are practiced freedoms, repeated until they matter. Practice is how we keep alternatives alive. When the next pilot arrives as an email, soft font, friendly tone, green button, I will read it with more care. I will keep a copy. I will track its path. Because language travels, and because voluntary can become required in the small hours between a pilot and a policy. Because systems scale, and because scale simplifies. Because being named as in compliance changes the shape of a working life. They said it was voluntary. Then it was required. The sentence sits, as a fact does, in a ledger I keep for myself.